Hello everybody, welcome back to Mega Projects. I am your host, Simon Whistler, as always, and this one, well, you know, I look at what does well in the past, and I'm like, oh, you guys like military planes, huh? Well, how about this one, the Lockheed U-2? It's another one of these that kind of blows my mind when you consider, like, we're talking about something that was made in the past but is still in service today. Even with satellites and all of that stuff, you will soon see why, because, well, we cover it all in this video, and let's jump in. Since the Wright brothers conducted their first flight in 1903, humans have held a fascination with aviation. We marvel at Concorde's speed and design. We stare in awe as an Airbus A380, the largest passenger airliner in the world, heaves its massive bulk into the sky. By the way, I'll just note here, we have covered Concorde on this channel, as well as the Soviet version, the Concorde-ski, although they calls it something else. And if you'd like us to cover the A380, can also do that. Certainly a mega project. Not sure if it's got enough appeal, but you know what to do. Use the comments. Back to it. Most aircraft are made to be seen, but some are not. The skies above the Soviet Union during the 1950s and 1960s were a pretty dangerous place to be, but a groundbreaking little plane and its equally audacious pilots dared to venture where many thought impossible. The U-2 is a name you may have heard many times. Yes, as a band. But the chances are that you may never have seen one in real life. The very nature of the aircraft means they're often simply undetectable, phantoms of the skies. This is a spy plane which fundamentally changed how surveillance was done in the post-World War II era. Operating at altitudes that other aircraft couldn't hope to match, it was able to penetrate deep into the heart of enemy territory. But like much that arrived during the Cold War, this is a story about ingenuity, political intrigue, and adventure that borders on the utterly reckless. This was a real cloak and dagger tale, and it all began back in 1945, so that's where we start. The relief that the United States felt at the end of World War II was soon replaced by two things. Firstly, a determination to never be caught out like they were at Pearl Harbor, and secondly, the belief that the Soviet Union now posed a threat that needed to be addressed seriously and quickly. The Soviet Union remained somewhat of an enigma after the largest conflict the world had ever known. The air of cooperation and friendship quickly evaporated between the Soviets and the Americans and was soon replaced by distrust and suspicion. Military chiefs realized that the best information they had on the Soviet interior was from German photographs taken by the Luftwaffe during the war, and it was recommended that similar flights take place to gauge Soviet capabilities and perhaps even intentions. Yeah, that information was pretty out of date. It's like looking at old Google Maps. It's like, why is there a roundabout here? Help! High-altitude flying was needed because from the 1950s, the Soviet Union began vigorously protecting its borders from foreign aircraft. It was believed that an altitude of over 60,000 feet would be enough to stay out of range of the MiG-17, which was the Soviets' best interceptor aircraft, but could barely reach 45,000 feet. Just to be sure, a target of 70,000 feet was set for any potential surveillance flights, which is twice as high as the typical cruising altitude of a modern-day passenger liner. The only problem was no aircraft at that time could fly that high. Using the codename Bald Eagle, the US Air Force gave contracts to Bell Aircraft, Martin Aircraft, and Fairchild Engine and Airplane to develop proposals for a new type of reconnaissance aircraft. However, officials at Lockheed Corporation got wind of the project and decided to submit their own unsolicited proposal, a design known as the CL-282. Was Lockheed feeling a bit left out? This proposal was rejected by the Air Force in favor of the Bell 16 design submitted by Bell Aircraft because of doubts about the CL-282's engine and landing gear. However, it was not just the US Air Force that was mulling over high-altitude flights at that time. The CIA depended on the military for its reconnaissance flights, but was eager to carry out its own missions. Doubts about the Bell 16's altitude meant that the CIA stepped up their interest in the CL-282 and were eventually joined by the Air Force as well, with a joint project between the military and intelligence agency emerging. That contract that Lockheed received in March 1955 for the first 20 aircraft was for $22.5 million, around $215 million today. So it's kind of worth Lockheed taking that punt. The first $1.26 million, about 12.5 today, was apparently mailed to the house of lead engineer Clarence Johnson in February of 1955 to ensure that work continued throughout the negotiation phase. Lockheed agreed to deliver the first group of aircraft by 1955, with the final coming in November 1956. This is a schedule that the company not only managed to keep, they actually beat it, and they also brought the whole project in about $3.5 million under budget, which is $33 million under budget today. And no, we're not being sarcastic. The military process was kept as secretive as possible, with the CIA eager to keep the new plane and their involvement with it well under wraps. The usual purchasing of materials and instruments took on a much more covert aspect. When Johnson needed to place an order for altimeters calibrated to 24,400 meters, that's 80,000 feet, from a company whose instruments maxed out at 45,000 feet, the CIA obliged by setting up an entire cover story about an experimental rocket aircraft. The manufacturing of the U-2 was done at Lockheed's Skunk Works factory in Burbank, California. By the way, the Skunk Works is a whole super interesting. It's not really a mega project, but I could definitely cover it on one of my other channels. But Skunk Works, super interesting. Anyway, the testing of the plane was a bit more complicated because they couldn't do it in such a residential area. Instead, the prototypes were all dismantled and flown to a new, recently acquired facility in the Nevada desert, a facility that would soon become known as, you probably guessed, Area 51. It was at this point that the name was changed to U-2. The U stood for the rather ambiguous utility rather than reconnaissance, and the 2, well, there was already a U-1 and U-3, so I guess it kind of made sense. By the way, the U-1 is this tiny seaplane, the U-3 is just tiny monoplane, so it's kind of weird that they just slotted it in between those two, although I guess the Soviets would have never guessed what it was. It's like, yeah, 2 tiny planes and a super secret warplane. The U-2 is an extraordinary aircraft, but when it first appeared, most agreed it was kind of a pain in the ass to fly. This was mainly down to its design, and of course it was all made even more tricky when you're flying over enemy territory. The U-2 was built to minimum weight requirements, which meant very little margin for error while flying. So every plane in operation has a never exceed speed and a stall speed, both of which calculated by aircraft designers and manufacturers. Essentially, flying above the never exceed speed can lead to fatal structural problems, while flying below the stall speed will stall the plane and just leave it plummeting towards the earth. The life of the pilot is made considerably easier the wider these two numbers are apart. Modern 747, for example, will typically not go below 125 to 165 miles per hour in flight and won't exceed 570 to 600 miles per hour, which leaves plenty of room to operate. However, flying at high altitude doesn't give you much of a gap. In a U-2 at 21,300 meters, 70,000 feet, the margin between the two speeds is just 12 miles per hour. It's 19 kilometers an hour, which is an unbelievably fine line to remain within. In fact, on most missions, a pilot would fly the U-2 at just 6 miles per hour above its stall speed of 75 miles per hour, which is really slow for a plane, by the way. The landing gear was unlike anything seen before. Instead of using the traditional tricycle landing gear, the U-2 uses a bicycle format with 2 wheels at the front, close together, and 2 at the back, also close together. Then there are auxiliary wheels called pogos under each wing for stabilization. But these pogos, they're only attached when the plane is taking off, and they're just left behind on the runway. The method of landing was also very different. I mean, obviously they're super close together. The plane is designed to operate well at high altitude, but is a monster the closer you get to the ground. At lower altitude, the higher air density and lack of power-assisted control system makes the U-2 a bit of a bucking bronco to land, apparently. As a U-2 comes into land, a chase car follows it closely behind, driven by a second U-2 pilot who communicates the plane's altitude as it nears the Earth. Once it is just 61 centimeters, 2 feet above the runway, the pilot initiates a stall, and the aircraft falls to the runway, a process sometimes known as a controlled crash. And by the way, there is an amazing video of this on YouTube, which I probably can't use here because of copyright issues, but it's a camera in the chase car. So the car pulls onto the runway, chases the plane down, and you can see everything that's going on. It's awesome. Definitely check it out after this video. Now, U-2s have landed unassisted when needed, but the danger involved with the extended wings and lack of visibility means that a chase car is almost always used. Even after landing, the wide wingspan means it's still very hard to control. when the aircraft comes to a complete stop, it will naturally tilt one way or the other and rest on one of its wings. Only once the pogos are reattached can the plane taxi off the runway. With a wingspan of 31 meters, 103 feet, it is considerably larger than almost anything with the same size fuselage. The F-14 Tomcat, as an example, has a wingspan of just 20 meters, 65 feet, a full 11 meters, 36 feet shorter than a U-2. But in terms of length, they're almost identical at around 19 meters or 62 feet. The U-2 is also incredibly light at just 7,257 kilograms, that's 16,000 pounds, which is pretty much a third of the weight of the F-14 Tomcat, and it's powered by a single General Electric F118-101 turbofan engine, providing it with 17,000 pound-feet of thrust. The Tomcat has a similar engine and thrust, but with two of them, it packs considerably more power than the U-2. In the early days, U-2 pilots were kitted out with primitive pressurized spacesuits, the designs of which would go on to be used on the early space shuttles. This partial pressurization in the cockpit created the effect of being at 8,500 meters, that's 28,000 feet on Earth, which is just 348 meters short of the summit of Mount Everest. The suit supplied a steady flow of oxygen throughout the flight, but even so, there were cases of pilots blacking out and crashing. Even in modern U-2s, a pilot can expect to lose around 5% of their body mass during an 8-hour mission, and many continue to report suffering from decompression sickness, which is caused when the pressure around you decreases more rapidly than the body can acclimatize to. The camera equipment has, of course, always been vital, and though it has changed over the years, it might not have changed as much as you think. The first U-2s were equipped with a Triumtragon A camera with three 610mm 24-inch focal length cameras and a vast 1,800 meters, 6,000 feet worth of film reel. Now you might think that in today's age it would all be digital now, but that's actually not the case. U-2s continue to use analog equipment as it is still considerably crisper than the alternative digital cameras. Newer cameras have meant that the coverage a U-2 can photograph in a relatively small amount of time is nothing short of extraordinary. At 21,300 meters, that's 70,000 feet, a pilot and the cameras on board can see up to 250 miles in all directions, meaning it would be possible to photograph the entire state of California in just a few hours. President Eisenhower was adamant that the military would not fly the plane to begin with, as it was feared that if the aircraft was downed and military personnel were found on board, it could be seen as an act of war. There was also a reluctance to use American pilots, so that if there was a crash, the military could say, no, not Americans. What are you talking about? Originally, 7 Greeks and 1 Pole were used to test the U-2 aircraft, but the language barrier as well as unsuitable flying experience meant that this was quickly reversed. By 1955, Air Force pilots who wished to participate in the program were required to resign their military commissions before joining the CIA as civilians, a process known as sheep dipping. The first flight over Soviet airspace took place on the 20th of June 1956, departing from the US Air Force Base at Wiesbaden in Germany and traveling over East Germany and Poland. On the 4th and 5th of July, U-2s flew much deeper, photographing the new Soviet submarine at Leningrad, present-day St. Petersburg, as well as counting the number of new Myasishchev M4 Bison bombers. The second day also saw the one and only time, allegedly, that a U-2 flew above and photographed Moscow, though it was not seen as a primary objective. However, the belief that the U-2s would remain undetected proved to be, well, completely unrealistic. How much the Soviets knew is hard to say, but U-2 pilots from those early missions have said that multiple MiGs were scrambled below them to try and shoot down the reconnaissance aircraft. At this early stage, only its extraordinary altitude saved it. The Soviets were furious, but at first kept the fact that their airspace had been breached a total secret. A week later, the Soviet Union made a formal complaint with regards to what they considered to be an American high-altitude bomber traveling above the Soviet Union. The US took advantage of the U-2's unique status to state that no military aircraft had traveled over the Soviet Union, which I guess was technically right, but also it wasn't right at all. Having thoroughly annoyed the Soviets, the US shifted the use of the U-2, at least for a short time, to the Middle East. Through U-2 pictures, American intelligence was able to predict the British, French, and Israeli action during the Suez Crisis 3 days before it occurred. Over the next few years, many of the U-2's operations came in that region, with multiple flights over Israel and also over Lebanon during the 1958 crisis in the country. The resumption of flights over or near the Soviet Union began in 1957 and led to what can only be described as a game of cat and mouse. Eisenhower insisted on personally approving any mission above Soviet airspace, but with increasing diplomatic pressure coming from further Soviet complaints, it was like walking a bit of a tightrope. But the president clearly believed that the benefits of such flights were worth the risk. Over the next few years, the US was able to photograph the Baikonur Cosmodrome near Turatam in Kazakhstan for the first time. The CIA had been completely unaware of the world's first space launch facility before these pictures emerged. Photographs of the Semipalatinsk nuclear test site and the Sarshagan missile test site, both in Kazakhstan, were also taken as the US began building up a clearer understanding of what lay inside Soviet borders. But just in case you thought it was only the US, the Soviets began deploying the Yak-25 also in 1955. This was a reconnaissance aircraft that couldn't match the U-2, but still proved to be useful to the USSR for surveillance all around the world. By 1960, the US knew full well that the Soviets had improved their surface-to-air missiles, but the flight still continued. Any guesses about what might happen next? Well, an operation originally scheduled for the end of April and codenamed Grand Slam would prove to be the most infamous flight in the U-2's history. The flight from Peshawar in Pakistan to Bodo in Norway would traverse the USSR for the first time. On previous routes, the U-2s had always entered and exited along the same path. Operation Grand Slam would allow the US to photograph a whole host of sites, including Turatam, Sverdlovsk, Kirov, Kotlas, Severodvinsk, and Murmansk. It was an incredibly ambitious 9-hour flight plan, and one that was almost doomed from the outset. The pilot that day was Francis Gary Powers, the most experienced U-2 pilot with 27 missions. Due to delays, the flight was pushed back to the 1st of May, a decision the US would soon live to regret. Like many countries, May the 1st was a public holiday in the Soviet Union, meaning that there were considerably fewer flights in the air, making the U-2 easier to track by radar. The Soviets began tracking the U-2 15 miles outside the border. It's not entirely clear how many attempts to shoot it down were made prior, but 4.5 hours into the flight, and over Sverdlovsk in central Russia, an SA-2 missile detonated behind the U-2 at 21,000 meters up, that's 70,500 feet. The explosion sent the U-2 hurtling downwards. At that altitude, it was always assumed that the impact would just completely destroy the aircraft, but what crashed that day remained surprisingly intact. Powers survived the crash after bailing out and parachuting to the ground, but he was quickly captured while the Soviet authorities began carefully examining this strange American plane that had dropped out of the sky. I guess they're excited. No, it's not a warplane. It's not a military plane. It's like we found this military dude on board who works for the CIA and, lots of film. The Americans had a cover story for such an occasion. Of course they did. And the tall tale of a NASA research flight having crashed was quickly spun. No one believes this. At this point, the USA was fairly certain that Powers hadn't survived and that the plane was most likely destroyed, while the Soviets held their tongue to see what the US reaction would be. On May the 7th, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev announced to the world that not only had the US been caught spying red-handed, but that the Soviet Union now had the U-2 wreckage and the very much alive pilot. It was a deeply embarrassing moment for all involved with the US program, and Eisenhower eventually admitted that the CIA had been operating spy planes above Soviet territory for several years. Francis Powers was eventually sentenced to 3 years in prison, but on the 10th of February 1962, the USSR exchanged him and American Frederick Pryor, a student who had been wrongly arrested, for Rudolf Abel, a Soviet intelligence officer at Glienicke Bridge, which connected East and West Berlin. And if you haven't seen that Tom Hanks movie, that I can't remember the name of, where they do lots of stuff on that bridge, that's worth seeing. This wasn't a helpful plug.
What can I look for?
The Powers incident proved hugely damaging for the US intelligence agency, but despite plenty of reorganization and tweaking of protocols, normal service resumed over the next couple of years, predominantly staying clear of the USSR. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 saw the U-2 used numerous times to photograph the Soviet MRBM missiles in San Cristobal, and on the 27th of October, one was shot down over Cuba, killing its pilot. This was an event which proved to be a huge coup for America's enemies. U-2s were also used frequently during the Vietnam War, in which modified versions were launched from aircraft carriers for the first time. They were later heavily involved during both Gulf Wars, and by early 2010, the 99th Expeditionary Reconnaissance Squadron had flown over 200 missions during Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom. U-2s would later help to enforce the no-fly zone over Libya in 2011, while also providing much-needed imagery of the Japanese nuclear reactor that was damaged by the earthquake and tsunami on the 11th of March 2011. The current U-2s came into service in the 1980s, but the 1st of August 2020 will signify 75 years since this bold little plane first took to the skies. In total, 109 U-2s were built between 1955 and 1989. This is almost unparalleled longevity, especially in the age of satellites and drones, but the U-2's ability to change surveillance objectives at short notice sets it apart from other surveillance techniques. At 75, you'd probably imagine that the U-2 is creeping towards retirement age, and while maybe it is, but also maybe not. The date that these great spies of the skies were due to be put out to pasture, so to speak, has been continuously pushed back again and again. First 2012, then 2004, and now it seems they'll be around till at least 2023, although Lockheed has said that the U-2 is viable until 2050. There is something truly classic about the U-2 story. Groundbreaking engineering mixed with tales fit for a good old-fashioned Cold War spy novel. This plane broke so many barriers, both mechanically and geographically, but it is a testament to their extraordinary design that they are still operating on the front lines of modern espionage today. So guys, I really hope you enjoyed this mega project. I did. I think these warplanes that serve, or might serve, for 100 years are incredible. If you've got other ones that you'd like me to cover, please do let me know in the comment section below. Upvote the ones you like. I really do go there to find topic ideas for mega projects, so that would be great of you. Smash that like button if you liked it. Smash that dislike button if you didn't. Don't forget to subscribe. Tell a friend. And thank you for watching.